I'm Gerard Dache. I'm the Executive Director of the Government Blockchain Association. I'd like to thank all of you who are in the room and all of those folks on livecast or live stream. Let me tell you I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Government Blockchain Association, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the event, and then introduce the guest. I'm going to say something briefly. I'll let the guests introduce them as well. So the Government Blockchain Association is a 501c6 nonprofit. We're essentially a business league. We bring government and the private sector together to solve problems using blockchain technology. We have about 15,000 people attending events in 90 cities around the world. So events like this, they function a lot like meetups. They develop a community, right, so people relationships. We have about 50 working groups focusing on everything from asset management to voting to cannabis to healthcare, identity management, supply chain, many different working groups. And what happens in the working groups is folks in government and the private industry come together, and the folks in government say, here's our problems, here's our challenges, here's what we're trying to solve. And the folks in the working group say, here's our solutions, here's our white papers. And they work together to connect, communicate, and collaborate. We do events like this around the world. We have certification training programs. We have a member directory. So if you're looking for blockchain resources, you can go to our website, gbaglobal.org. You can search for people by domain, language, location, technology. You can search for organizations. So if you're a government contractor and you're looking for someone that knows something about healthcare or wallets, we have a full directory. I've been told that we are becoming the site on the internet where folks look for information for government and blockchain. We've got about 8 gigs worth of information. I understand that we get about 40,000 hits a month with about, I think our best day was 13,390 hits in a single day. But most importantly, we don't try to sell anything. We try to bring people together and create opportunities in the space. When I started this, I realized there was a lot of folks interested in blockchain, but there weren't a whole lot of places for them to go. Right, so we said, let's create a place for them to go, and then when we get enough people in the room or on the call, they can figure it out and they can develop relationships. I'm thrilled to see the relationships that have developed, like many of you in the room already. Anyway, that's enough about GBA. Let me tell you a little bit about the folks that are on the panel. But before I do, I want to thank Georgetown University for giving us this space. We're thrilled that they think enough of us to let that happen. And we have Evan Smith with Cogent Law Firm, who's doing the audio video. Sarah is our social media person. If you guys have any communications need, you need help with newsletters, social media, anything like that, please talk to Sarah. She has some capacity available and is a phenomenal resource. Kathy, my wife, is outside helping us with logistics. Kevin Gottlieb, our operations guy, is back there. So these are some folks you can turn to if you have any questions. And we have so many people in the room I'd like to introduce. I just don't have the time. But let me tell you about these incredible people. So Nabeel is he is the lead of our mining and cryptocurrency working group. He runs an organization called Cryptolitics. They write several articles every day on cryptocurrencies, the market. He is an incredible resource in the cryptocurrency space. Bryant Nielson he's the executive director of the blockchain Capital Wave. And for the last several years, they've been training people in the financial industry on this technology. And in addition to that, he runs a podcast called the Blockchain 360 and has been interviewing some of the top people in the world on blockchain technology. So he's an incredible wealth of information on that subject. And I always call you Giles, and I apologize. The correct pronunciation is Gilles.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
I've been called many things, so.
Yeah, I know. But he's a professor here at Georgetown University in the accounting space. He also runs the what's the group that you run here? Is it Hyperledger?
It's the Hyperledger DC meetup groups that is operating out of this building.
Yeah, and he's got an incredible background in accounting and risk management. He's worked with the law enforcement in I guess it's in France, right?
Yeah, I'm also an adjunct at the French Military Police Academy.
Yeah, so he's so from a risk management corporate perspective, phenomenal. And then we're very honored to have former Congressman Jim Moran. Jim, the more I learn about you and the more I engage with you, the more I like and respect you.
Seriously.
Now, maybe there's stuff there that I didn't read, but let me tell you what I've learned. I have to tell you just a quick funny story how I met Jim. We actually met, right? I don't know if you remember this, but we were washing our hands, and he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Bodacious." Bodacious. Bodacious. What is that? What's the definition of that, right? How do you spell it? And I could tell he was thinking about how to increase his repertoire of language, which is a very interesting topic. And we talked back, and I said, I don't know, maybe I just made it up. And then he looked at me with the most incredible disdain, and he said, like, I've totally wasted his time, right? So then we both leave, and then we both end up speaking on the same panel. And I just, as we were talking, I just became incredibly impressed with him. And as I've gotten to know him and actually watch him from afar, he's worked with so many people on both sides of the aisle in such a collaborative space. He's been incredibly kind to me, and he's come to events and give us advice. And professionally, he has managed. He's been in the House Ways and Means Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committee. He literally was involved in managing trillions of dollars to spend. Right. So he is an incredible resource that we're here, and we're very grateful that he's participating with us. So with that,
Thank you, Jim.
thank you, Jim. With that, do you want to introduce yourself, or did I cover it?
I think you covered it.
Okay. All right.
Anything more would be just too self-serving.
Right. So I want to start with Nabeel and cryptocurrency adoption. So Nabeel, from your perspective, where are we in terms of cryptocurrency adoption? In terms of where we come from, where we are now, and what do you think the pathway is to cryptocurrency? Do you think it's going to take over completely, a little bit? Just sort of talk about that.
I think we're in some exciting times, right? So the whole bubble burst that Bitcoin hit to 20,000 and came back to 3, now it's around 4. That happened, but in the background, what people don't realize happening is the fundamentals getting stronger. There's big companies coming into the market like Fidelity. They're the #1 asset holders. They hold, I think, trillions of dollars. They just became institutional custodians of digital currency. IBM just launched a huge endeavor with 62 countries on their payment wire with a coin called Stellar. So I think from the roots, cryptocurrency is getting much stronger, and it's growing fundamentally where people have easier access to it. Square's CEO launched Bitcoin on his platform. Coinbase just became $1 billion company. So it's becoming more mainstream. I think adoption, for mass adoption, is still going to take some time. I think we're a few years from that, but building the blocks to get there, I think it's happening as we speak. I'll tell you a funny story. People talk about how digital currency can't change the world, but for some people, it is changing the world. In Venezuela right now, their currency inflation happened at thousands of percent. You need more weight in their paper fiat currency than a pound of chicken cost. So there, Bitcoin is doing phenomenal. The most amount of transactions that are happening right now per capita right now is in Venezuela because people don't trust that country's currency anymore. The KFC, the McDonald's, the restaurants, the landlords, they all take cryptocurrency there because the local government cannot infiltrate it or modify Bitcoin or drag the price down because they don't control it. That's where the impact will come hard and swift as third world countries.
So I actually think we're already in a society where everything has become digital. Just the transformation of, I look at what I spend and almost none of it is in cash. We already are at that digital society where cash has become represented in ones and zeros. The conversion from that to blockchain will actually happen, and we won't even know that it happens simply because it'll be transparent to everyone here. There's a lot of incentives for governments to do it simply because now they can track money. The way it is now is if I take a bill and I hand it to each of you and you just keep passing it along, there is no audit trail as to the path of that. But we do everything already in a digital society. I think that the concept of cryptocurrencies, as we now understand them, is going to actually this is my opinion, take a much minor role than what our fiat currencies are currently doing, because they'll just become a blockchain currency and we won't even know or care. So at least that's my opinion.
Yeah, so I guess there are three types of coins, right? The ones that are backed by trust, the ones that are backed by hard assets, and the ones that are backed by some sort of venture, right? ICOs. The first one, backed by trust, I think have an advantage when you trust more the system than the local central bank. You were giving the example of Venezuela, and one can think of a few other countries where
Absolutely.
perhaps the trust in the central bank is somewhat questionable.
Yeah.
But in general, I think people trust the Federal Reserve Bank more than me if I start issuing coins, right? Then there are the ones that are backed by hard assets, right? So Venezuela does that with oil, I understand. Sometimes with gold, sometimes with DNA information, whatnot. That offers a much stronger structure, right? And what some central banks have started to do is to offer us cryptocurrency that are tied to their own currency. So the Chinese central bank, for example, owns something like 60, 70 patents in that space, so that they're able to deliver this type of product at some point. And then we've got the ICOs, but that's an entire different animal. So I suspect we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, my intent is to try to listen and learn, and even maybe pick up some understanding through osmosis. I will share my thoughts, though, which are I'm not expert on the subject at all, but we do have an environment, a political environment, certainly, where distrust of government is contributing to a collective desire to have a way to avoid being controlled by government. The Venezuelan situation is an ideal situation where it exposes the need for something like this, where people can take this kind of power to control their finances in their own hands. Otherwise, if they don't, they're going to be left penniless. And then we see other countries like Estonia, for example, I understand is really converted to Bitcoin. Now, it's a homogeneous population, a relatively small government, but one that is highly vulnerable to its principal neighbor, Russia. And so it too needs to achieve some kind of independence from reliance on traditional forms of financial exchange. Beyond that, the government itself has become sclerotic, if you will. It's been built up, but it's been built up on the same programs. I mean, it's even more pronounced now where virtually every year it's what's called a continuing resolution, where you just fund the programs that were funded last year at the same level of money. Very little relative innovation and a strong resistance to disruptive technology. Even the workforce needs to change dramatically. I'll give you some anecdotal examples as we proceed further. And I think once we get to the tipping point where companies realize they've missed the boat and too many people are on the boat and it's ready to set sail, and all of a sudden they're feeling anxious, we're not ready, then things are going to start happening rapidly. We're not at that point by any means now, but this is what needs to happen. We'll look back upon these sessions and realize this kind of bold collaboration and a disruptive technology is absolutely necessary as a foundational step in the march forward of blockchain technology.
I'm going to ask Kevin Gottlieb to come up for a second, because we were approached not too long ago by the government of Cameroon, right? And Kevin, I was wondering if you could maybe share from Cameroon's perspective what some of their interested in.
So Cameroon right now is going through a civil war right now. There's French-speaking and English-speaking peoples in Cameroon, and the English speakers have broken off, formed their own government, and are trying to claim independence. And so what happened is they were trying to figure out, all right, how do we fund this revolution? How do we fund this breakaway? And decided, all right, we're going to create cryptocurrency. We're going to back it by assets, because Cameroon's very land rich. It has a lot of assets. And so they said, we're going to create our cryptocurrency and base it on the assets of our land. And the French-speaking Cameroonian government reached out to us and they said, hey, what is your position on this? Because they didn't know much about cryptocurrency. They said, what's going on here. So we put together a white paper, just kind of explaining the situation. And because with cryptocurrencies, what they can do is they can fund their revolution internationally. Anyone can buy it. It becomes an ICO, way of raising money. So for a lot of people, they said, what we told them is that if they pushed too hard on this, it could end up creating sympathy overseas, and people could invest in the ICO out of sympathy. So we told them that, and just gave them some other information.
So for the panel, from a government standpoint, right, as government looks at the adoption of cryptocurrency, right, so we heard about in Cameroon, they're concerned about rebellions. What do you think government perspective is on the use of the continued increase of cryptocurrency?
I got it. I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult for every government to grasp the concept of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology for one simple rule. They lose control, right? They lose control on printing the money, controlling the money, using the money, inflation rates, interest rates. I think it's a big paradigm shift for any government organization, maybe in the United States or India or Europe, to fully grasp that concept, right? Just because it's so different from what we've been doing for the past 300 years in banking. And I think it's going to take a lot of resistance to overcome that. Right, let me give you an example. Like in India right now, it's the biggest democracy in the world. They have 1.3 billion people. Cryptocurrency is banned in that country because the Federal Reserve of India doesn't want cryptocurrency to become mainstream. Same reason, out of the 1.3 billion, 1/3 of that country is unbanked because they're farmers. They rarely have electricity. Nobody wants to give them a bank account. That's where Bitcoin can help them because they can access money or move money through a cell phone. But then again, back and forth with the Federal Reserve and their judicial system, they've decided to ban it completely as of now. So those are some big hurdles when you talk about open and free currency that one entity or a central organization doesn't control.
I actually have a contrarian viewpoint, and that is that countries are going to adopt cryptocurrencies very slowly. In first world countries, we already have a system that works very efficiently. If we want to think about interbank transfers, the SWIFT consortium has already moved to blockchain. We don't even know about that. But I think that the leap from where we are today to where actually it'll be destabilizing governments is too great. It's not just across a river, it's across an ocean. And so it's fun to talk about these things and think about them in the sense that wouldn't it be great if this happened, or how would this be so disruptive? It's not even possible. I mean, we can imagine certain things, but to get from here to there is beyond our current imagination. I think there'll be slow adoption of cryptocurrencies in very specific use cases, and that's what will happen. And the other aspect of it is that blockchain is not just cryptocurrencies. I mean, I teach about blockchain all day long, and the way I describe it is blockchains are these big sequoia trees. Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies are big sequoia trees. They're massive, they're impressive, they reach unimaginable heights, they are just amazing trees. But they're not the forest. The forest is the technology, which is blockchain. We're going to see these massive trees as part of the entire forest. And so the forest is really where we should be focusing at, because it's going to be larger, it's more productive, it encounters more parts of our life. I mean, if you thought of just the supply chain, there is a lot of people who will make an argument that you actually have to have cryptos to be a part of any supply chain or any blockchain solution. I personally disagree with that. We don't need, as an example in the financial sector, to create a token to represent an Apple share, a share of Apple. We don't need to create another barrier to it. It can just be the asset. It can be a digital representation of the asset. I think that that's where we should be focusing on, because that's really where the more disruption is going to happen. If all of a sudden the governments can actually do certain things, and I mean, the most possible and simplest implementation of blockchain will be in the Patent and Trademark Office. perfect use case for what blockchain is capable of. Doesn't need to be a cryptocurrency. But cryptocurrencies are an important thing, but I think that they're going to be diminishing their role over time.
It's interesting because Nabeel is a cryptocurrency expert and Brian is a blockchain expert. But to your point, it kind of talks about the forest, right? It is a forest. Jonathan, thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree to a large extent with what you're saying, right? So we tend to think of cryptocurrencies and say fiat currencies are two separate and related animals, but we tend to see a convergence between the two, right? And the convergence is coming through the technology, started with blockchain, but there are other distributed ledger technologies that are starting to appear that are more robust in certain ways and can facilitate that aspect. And then, as you mentioned, technology can be applied to the financial world in many ways, aside from the trading, right? So you can think of a lot of back office transactions that could happen through this, or can be facilitated through this technology, particularly in fragmented markets.
Well, as an example, I'm just going to feed off of that. Santander Innovations, which is a development firm by the Santander Bank, which is a Spanish bank, they've actually estimated that for the financial sector alone, the adoption of blockchain to the settlement process will save somewhere between $40 to $60 billion a year. And that's just amazing. They also estimate that the technology, if it was adopted in the financial sector, would also eliminate almost 60% of all middle and back office personnel.
So there are probably some opportunities there. Having said this, I think there is one aspect that people perhaps don't pay enough attention to, and it's the fact that you have legacy systems, and those are a big issue in the financial world, right? When you look at the languages, the programming languages that financial institutions use today, they use COBOL from the 60s, right? And they're very slow to change the system, to integrate, and for good reasons, because they have to maintain system integrity. They have to make sure everything talks to each other like in the way it's supposed to be. They have legal obligations, of conserving data and whatnot. Now here you've got an emerging technology that is changing, like by the minute would be an exaggeration, but by the month is probably not an exaggeration, right? How does that fit in that culture? How does it fit in that system? And then the other aspect is cryptography is very important for this technology, right? If we break the code, we have a big problem, right? And we don't know what the future of cryptography is going to be. In particular, we're going to have quantum computers coming up at, in the relatively near future. When I talk to experts on that topic, if I ask 2 people, I get 4 answers. So maybe at the end we'll be fine, but I'm not sure anyone can say, with the cryptographic tools that we're using today, we're going to be fine 5, 10, 20 years from now. And that's the type of horizon that financial institutions are facing, and even longer, right? So that aspect, I think, is not thought through enough at the moment.
I think another big issue is when you talk about blockchain and implementing it in a Fortune 500 company, blockchain isn't modular, right? You're not going to fit it into their existing systems. And I think the company itself has to invest a lot of money, a lot of time, and redo their entire systems. Like I work for the government, and we look for systems that are modular, that will fit and coexist with our current systems. Because if we were to redefine everything, it would take us 20 years and billions of dollars. And I think that's the biggest hurdle in adopting blockchain into one company organization, because you have to change every other system that touches it, because it's not compatible.
Well, Gerard, thank you, not just for being the Pied Piper of this government blockchain, but movement, if you will, but for assembling such bright people. It's really intimidating. But let me underscore some things that have been said. So back in the 90s, there was a guy by the name of H. Ross Perot. Most of the people are too young to even remember who he was. But so he owned a company called EDS. And what they wanted to do was to introduce new computers. So this was well over a decade ago. So they're old computers now, but they were really new and much more efficient at the time. And so it was a $2 billion program to introduce these computers to all of the Navy and Marine Corps desk personnel, if you will. And they did it through the defense budget because that's where we had the most money to work with. And so we bought the computers. We provided all of the training. A lot of folks never went to the training, so we put it on their desk in front of them. So it was difficult not to see it. I think they must have gone out to lunch or something while it was on there, but they were all using COBOL. And we spent 3 years to introduce it. And finally, we just gave up. So what we did, we put the new computer alongside the old computer and just hoped that it would not just collect dust. And I think eventually at least half of those personnel finally figured out, probably because they started talking to the kids and realized they needed to do it. And so we gradually implemented it. It was extraordinarily frustrating and disappointing. But it was an example of the kind of reactionary attitude, the resistance that you're going to find in any large institution. Yeah. And there's really, in the federal government, there's really very little incentive to modernize. There's a lot of incentive to just keep doing the things the way, and you control the data, and so it's your playground, and you can decide whether you're going to introduce any new ideas, any new toys. So there's also a program that was designed to introduce this kind of technology. It's called SBIR, Small Business Innovative Research. And the largest SBI program, again, is in defense because that's where the money is. We have a technology that you can put on a big ship, an aircraft carrier, a plane, whatever, and it will immediately, automatically test and reset test the technology. Because what they have been doing is they send out a twin ship or use a twin plane. They use the whole big weapon. It can be $100 million plane or $1 billion ship just to test whether it works. So this can save up to 80% of your research money just for the testing and evaluation. It's just an enormously disruptive technology. So what the Defense Department has decided is to buy it and bury it, which is generally what happens with new disruptive. It's what happened with the UAV technology until the private sector just took it over, developed it. But they don't want to have to close down a large part of their research lab. They don't want to have to lay off all these people who were involved in the traditional way of testing and evaluation. So I think this is going to be a long, slow sludge to introduce it, but it is going to happen in the private sector. Where's Scott? There's Scott with Raytheon. So Scott has looked into this, writes a blog and so on. I don't know if the executives at Raytheon even know what you're doing, but you're doing the right stuff. So so Walmart had to track this shipment of mangoes because it could have really cost them a whole lot of money and credibility, reputation, and so on if these mango, if it had a virus or whatever in it. So they had to track it. So it took them 6.5 days to track the mango from the place where it was grown to the store. They put in blockchain technology and did it in 2.5 seconds. So if that kind of technology exists in the private sector, eventually the public sector is going to have to follow suit. Now let me throw up one other, hopefully provocative thought. So my generation has bankrupted my grandchildren's generation. They're just really screwed. So I'll use her as an example. So this young lady. So when she's my age, I hope you live that long, but I hope you have well, whatever, a different life in many respects. But you're going to be paying more in interest cost on the debt that we have accumulated than for anything else. There'll be, of all the things that benefit you directly, you're going to be paying more out to pay off the debt that your parents and grandparents have incurred. I mean, it's 22 trillion now. Trillion is a lot of money. For a million seconds is what, 11 days. A billion seconds is like 31 years. And we're talking trillions. So it's hard to get our mind around. But every year now, we're destined to have $1 trillion annual deficit. It's far more than any of our government think tanks and official agencies have estimated. And it's an indictment to the legislative branch because people like tax cuts and they like us to give them more money. And so we do both. And, it's easy to figure it out. So $1 trillion annual deficit. In a few years, we're going to have 30 trillion of debt. So there's no way you can continue Social Security, Medicare, and the Medicaid portion that pays for nursing homes, which is the largest portion of Medicaid. It can't be done. And you shouldn't have to do it. I know I'm putting your whole generation on your shoulders, but I'm using you as an example. So as a point. So what do? The only thing you're really going to be able to do is to devalue the currency. But there may be an alternative. And the alternative may be a Bitcoin, blockchain technology. So you just go around the government.
Yeah.
You just seize things, take things into your own hands. You figure out how to do it. I mean, we're never going to be in the situation that Maduro has put Venezuela in, but it's going to be bad. So there needs to be an alternative. And I suspect this may be one of the things that the young generation figures out. We're just going to kind of have our own, currency exchange. We're going to survive. We're going to figure it out ourselves. And we're going to be far less dependent upon the government that really has treated us, in our future unfairly.
That's awesome because it segues right into sort of my next question. And I kind of have two parallel paths, and you can address either one of them if you like. One is clearly there's some problems at the federal level, right? But we also see a lot of activity at the state and local level, right? So there's some state, and we have both international and international, right? So we have some cities and states saying, we're going to do things different. We're going to do things our way, right? Sort of in opposition to the government. And then we also have the pull between the private sector and the public sector, right? So what I'd like you guys to comment from your different perspectives is either of those two things, right? If we have individuals like this young lady who start to use cryptocurrency and essentially to go around the government, right? That puts the government in a tough spot because they can't just continue to produce more supply, right? So it might be that the people kind of pull government in a particular direction so that they have to deal with it. And Brian, I know you deal with a lot of financial institutions, and they're coming up with ways to use blockchain and different cryptocurrencies, essentially in the financial system. But we have the tug of war between the government and the people, right? And the tug of war between the government and the private sector. So if you just talk to a little bit about, how that conflict might potentially play itself out.
We wrote an article on statistics. So they were saying 38% of all millennials own a digital currency. Under the age of 30, I believe 38% of all millennials own a digital currency. This is the generation that grew up with internet, right? I kind of grew up with internet, but I kind of got into the computer internet world when I was about 15, not when I was 5 years old or 7 years old. For the next generation, internet, digital currency, it's going to be the norm. It's going to be the way they've always lived life. For us, it's a paradigm shift, but I think for them, it will be a normal way of life. And I think that generation has gone through the big bank crisis, and the lack of trust in big banks is there. It's rooted in that generation. Would they trust their $5,000 savings to a bank or in Bitcoin as a store of value. And I think they're leaning towards digital currency because they can control it. They can use it from anywhere in the world, send it to somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning. They don't have to wait for the banks to open up. They don't have to ask for anybody's permission. It's giving them access to their money from anywhere in the world at any time of day. And I think that's where the shift slowly will start happening.
I actually think that you're wrong. Don't take it personally.
A lot of people do.
Actually, for the congressman, I mean, you mentioned something as one of the biggest barriers, and that is there'll be this institutional barrier for adoption. When a person's job is required to not learn a new technology to keep their job, they're not going to learn the new technology. Their job depends on them not doing that. So while there's this institutional value that is created, the individuals are not going to want to do it. As it relates to state and local governments, blockchain has the ability to actually remove jobs. Well, if you're a state or local employee for the government, are you going to want to adopt this? The answer is going to be completely no. So, I mean, and when you look, that's just the public sector. The private sector has a similar problem. The only difference is that there are central groups of people, top management, that make these decisions, can actually force it onto the institution. As it relates to cryptocurrencies, I don't know if I would agree with 34% of all millennials own cryptocurrency. I mean, I have 2 sons and only one of them do, but
that's 50%, right?
wait. In my immediate family, but the other aspect of it is that they're all. I mean, my oldest is 30 and my youngest is 27.
That's
all their
100. That's 100% of the millennials.
Okay. Right. I would say of their group of friends, you extend it out to 100. Maybe it's only my son who is an owner of it. The other aspect of it is this.
Can we take a quick poll? How many people in the room own cryptocurrencies?
Wait. No. How many
I
millennials
know,
are in the
I
room
know.
that own cryptocurrencies? You're not a millennial.
What was the question?
No, I mean,
Yeah, but you can't count yourself.
Yeah, but this is not a random sample
Right.
off the street.
The other aspect of it is that cryptocurrencies have 2 problems with it. One is volatility. The volatility of cryptocurrencies is not stable enough for anyone to put their entire asset pool into this technology.
but
You can disagree with me. That's fine, but you're not going to do that. If you looked at, I was in Moscow speaking at a conference when it hit 20,000. By the time I got back, it was 18,000. So we already lost 10% in a flight.
Yeah.
From flying from Moscow back to New York, a flight we lost 10%. The volatility is just too dramatic. And the other aspect of it is it's just too expensive. We're not talking about when Bitcoin was first introduced that the transaction fee was a fraction of a penny. These are now high, super high costs. And as a result of that, what you're looking at is a situation that you can't go buy your cup of coffee with Bitcoin. 2 reasons. It takes 10 minutes to actually clear it.
No, it doesn't. Lightning Network's taken over. I can send you Bitcoin right now, and you'll have it within 30 seconds.
No,
Right?
the reality of it is that it's not a complete. Yes, Lightning Network is an alternative. It's actually a side chain to Bitcoin.
But it's being implemented, right? So the
Being
transaction
is
time,
not that it's fully implemented.
but the transaction time's a lot quicker now.
Yes, but the cost is still high. And so those are 2 problems. One is high volatility. The second is the transaction cost. There are blockchain technologies that are not Bitcoin and not Ethereum that actually have gotten that down to fractions of a penny, but they're still not widely deployed.
I agree. And I mean, I think it's a growing technology, right? I think we're still on infant stages. If you look at the market cap of cryptocurrency right now, we're at 130 billion. NASDAQ alone is 8 trillion. So we're not developed fully, and I think there's still a lot of development infrastructurally happening. Square app, you can buy Bitcoin for less than 1% right now. There is development happening, and I think it will continue to happen.
Perhaps two dimensions. One would be the critical infrastructures, right? So at this point, we don't typically use blockchain or distributed ledger technologies to maintain the critical infrastructures, but there is perhaps a discussion about going in that direction. How do we do this? I mean, typically those infrastructures are done either by the government or monitored by the government very closely. And now we have an open distributed system potentially. How does that fit in that part? Because if we're talking about application to the financial world, that's going to come up at some point. And I understand that certain non-NATO foreign states are paying keen attention to those issues, perhaps getting into some technical committees, trying to influence the way the technology, the standards are going. One perhaps would imagine that they have an ulterior motive for doing this, right? So that's one aspect, right? The second aspect, it's more like the commercial side. So I'm not going to get into the great debates of the cryptocurrencies, but things like, do you want to use a cryptocurrency to order your pizza and things like this, okay? And that's probably need to be regulated as well for other reasons. And the question is, who is pushing for this, right? And it seems like in the US, sometimes the federal government is pushing, sometimes the states are pushing. So on the privacy side, the states are dominating the conversation, and the federal government is playing catch up. Cryptocurrency, it's a little bit more complicated. You see this coming from different dimensions. The federal government is moving, the states are moving. But clearly some states are playing a very important role, right? For example, we talked about stablecoins before. The state of New York played an important role in regulating that aspect and granting authorization and whatnot, right? So here we have the classical issue of how much competition we want, right? No competition is probably not good because then you have a very stale system, there's no emulation. On the other hand, you don't want a system that is so fragmented that no one has a solution for anything that could be leveraged, right? So I was at the Fed 2 days ago on some event on cybersecurity, and one of the speakers there was saying, look, every year a new state passes a new regulation, and that state takes 40% of my time for that year. That's not efficient. Can you guys come up with a unified system? So I think that tension between competition between the municipalities, the states, and the federal government, let alone states outside the U.S. In terms of emulation, but also standardization, is a very important debate that is perhaps not as structured as it could be.
Yeah, there's a health and hospital care system in Arizona, I know, that is using the blockchain / Bitcoin technology because they were just finding so much fraud in the system. And they're doing so with the understanding and encouragement of the Medicare program. And I think you're probably seeing that all over the country. It's not widespread, but some are taking the initiative. Although, this latter point in terms of the essential value of Bitcoin, which really kind of doesn't exist yet, the people who helped them and who invested were rewarded with Bitcoin. Yeah. And they've lost about 80% of their original investment. Now,
depends when you got in.
Huh?
It depends when you got in.
It
right?
sure does. Absolutely. And of course, they get in at the peak when there's excitement, and then it settles down. But it's extraordinary. It's more volatile than NASDAQ or any other kind of risk that you can make right now. I do think there needs to be a greater stabilization of the Bitcoin exchange. Because it's going to frighten people, that kind of volatility. But there has to be a balance between giving over, to control the regulatory authorities versus the kind of independence that they have now. But that volatility is a serious concern.
Right.
Yeah, Jim, you just came back from overseas, and we talked shortly after that, and you talked about a use case for blockchain in government. What do you panelists think, and I'll start with Jim and you come back, about some of the areas, right, some of the problems that government has, right, where blockchain potentially might be a solution. So what are some of those areas? And there's a lot, right? So and then in those areas, what do you think are some of the drivers and maybe some of the resistance in those areas where blockchain really could make a positive impact in government?
But so we're incredibly blessed in the United States with the security and the stability that we have. We take it for granted. There are other countries, particularly emerging democracies, where it's just extraordinarily difficult to do the right thing. There, in almost every country, there are oligarchs. There's a financial system. They've been selling the natural resources of the country, and the people have been marginalized. So activists try to take over and take back the government on behalf of the people. The government has they have three principal means of control. One, obviously, is physical force, the military, the police. Secondly, is communication. If you can't communicate, and overcome the propaganda sent out by the state, then you have no ability to organize. Technology is overcoming that. We really are making strides in that area. The third is the means of exchange, of financial exchange. If you control the banks and lending instruments, people really can't get on their feet financially. So the third leg of that effort to overcome resistance to democratic movements, obviously, is what we're talking about. And and some of these activists within emerging parliaments are looking at blockchain and Bitcoin as a way of achieving independence. They are taking advantage of the fact that almost every government is reactionary. They don't want to understand this stuff. They just want to crush it. But I don't think they can. And it crosses borders. So it's really not a sovereign kind of exchange that they can control. So I do think it offers opportunity for emerging democracies, because a democracy can't survive unless it has a source of financial security behind it. They've got to sell something. They've got to control some kind of resource of value, and they've got to be able to exchange currency. So I think this could work, and I'd love to see it work.
Yeah, so I was trying to talk about something else, and maybe I'll do that in just a second. But maybe if I could take the other side of the coin of what you said, right? Yeah. One issue with blockchain is that the information is not permanent but hard to control. So it's hard to erase. Mm-hmm. So imagine your situations where you've got an emerging democracy and you have information that is sensitive, your religion, for example. Mm-hmm. Okay. At the moment, it might be on your national ID card, yeah, but you can burn your national ID card, and perhaps the central record can be destroyed. Now, imagine the information is massively spread in a way that no one controls. That sensitive information could give some potential concerns for the protection of citizens in areas where you don't have law and order, right? So I take your point. But like anything, I think it has pluses and minuses, right? Sure. Coming back to your initial question, right, so where we could see this applying, there are, I would call that mundane applications, but they're actually very implications to procurement, administrative, saving cost and whatnot, right? One interesting application is to the control or the understanding of supply chains, okay? So, for example, medicines. I've seen different estimates, but I think the highest one I've seen is that 40% of the medicine in the circuits are counterfeit somehow.
That's an EU
statistics. I'm not going to vouch for this, but obviously this is a concern, and having visibility in the supply chain is being able to trace that is going to be important. One area where this might be particularly important would be in a military supply chain, in a couple of ways. even when you look at very expensive state-of-the-art pieces of equipment like fighter jets or whatever, they have off-the-shelf components that are coming from countries that have a strong industrial base but are overseas, right? We're not quite sure what's going on with those components, right? And there's no way to trace them up to the original manufacturer, be able to recall them, identify, making sure that they are up to standards and they're not creating an issue for those sophisticated pieces of equipment. Another application might be 3D printing. You're on a warship, you don't have space, you need to produce spare parts on the fly. How do you make sure that those new parts are actually well integrated in your inventory management system, right? Especially when records can be destroyed because something bad happened to the ships or goodness what, right? So those would be perhaps some applications of blockchain technology to governmental applications.
So, Gilles, are those technologies you think that could be implemented without a whole lot of resistance, or do you think that, like many other areas, it will be difficult, based on what Brian said, the change in technology?
But anything that is new is going to meet some resistance, right? One feature of the armed forces is typically at some point someone says, this is the way we're going to do it, and that's the way it's done, right? But if you're looking at other organizations, especially ones that are more fragmented, so we talked about supervision of medicines, you might have multiple regulators, states, federal, overseas. It's going to be a turf fight, that's for sure.
So, Jim, I want to go back to you for just a second. In implementing some of these new technologies, right? Look, I'll just be completely theoretical, right? There might be some companies that have a financial incentive in going the new technology versus the old technology, right? How do you see that kind of playing out, right? Because when we talk about big companies like Raytheon, and you have big companies, and then you have smaller companies where a lot of the innovation is. From the political process, how difficult do you think it will be to essentially mandate some of these changes versus like the example that you said earlier, just try to kind of hope it takes off?
I don't think that the initiative is going to come from the legislative branch. Certainly not going to come from this executive branch. And nothing good will. But I think if the country were to elect, for example, a leader of the next generation, a bright millennial who brought in some new thinkers, sort of like John Kennedy did in the 60s. You introduce, all of a sudden and I liked Dwight Eisenhower, but he represented the middle class after the war and so on. But then there was this radical shift in the 60s, but it needed to be led by somebody that had public support, but knew enough to bring in new thought leaders who were not so risk averse, and but had a sufficient amount of public support. I think I'm not sure whether we can regain our credibility internationally, but I know that in the future it's going to be a global economy and a far more multicultural society. And the only way we're going to survive is by introducing and applying these disruptive technologies, because what we're relying upon now are just too inefficient. They're too ineffective. And while it seems if people are able to stay in their comfort zones, I don't think it's going to be a very comfortable zone in the future. So I do think we're on the verge of a fairly radical transition to the use of new technology. And if Bitcoin is part of it, blockchain is part of it. Driverless vehicles, Uber and Lyft, they're not making any money now. It's an experiment, but they go to driverless vehicles, and I mean, you can't do it in rural areas, but you can do it in some urban areas. There's going to have to be local leadership. Frankly, I'm encouraged by looking at, not you, Michael, but I'm encouraged looking at this audience. So I figured, what am I getting into here? And I figured, maybe it's going to be like 2 or 3 dozen, Harvard-educated kids in gray T-shirts and jeans.
Georgetown
Yeah, no, I understand you. I went to Holy Cross, so I know what you're saying. And I'm pleased to say you have indoor plumbing. I noticed the mention. So I figure it's going to be a bunch of these really smarty pants young kids that know more than anybody else, and a smattering of old white guys from Goldman Sachs or something who, once it works, they're ready to buy it up, and further concentrate. Well, that's not what this audience is, Gwen. This represents America, and I do think for these. I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, Gerard, and I don't mean
No,
to
this is
cause,
great.
cause some anxiety, but
You just roll with it.
I
This is
do
great.
think these disruptive technologies are going to have to emerge from the grassroots up. They're not going to be imposed from the top. The top is going to have to respond to this pressure that's building up in communities, in cities, particularly where you have the best and brightest kids. I hate to use such a trite phrase, but they're coming to these communities where they can sit at a coffee shop and share ideas, and they're becoming politically active using different, less traditional means of organizing, and that may cause the transition. Oftentimes, progress, it's slow, it's plodding, and then all of a sudden, there's this perfect storm, and all of a sudden, things happen before you even can realize what's happening before your eyes. And I think that this kind of technology is going to be part of that movement. At some point, it's going to reach this tipping point, and all of a sudden, corporations are going to say, and institutions and governments are going to say, uh-oh, we got to jump on board the ship. This is leaving the port, and we're going to left behind, and we don't want to be part of the left behind. So
That's excellent. And that's exactly why I really wanted you on this panel, because you bring that perspective that I think many of us don't have, right? Which is but there's a couple things I need to comment on what you said. We talked about Georgetown here,
Yeah.
right? The best of right. I understand now why Georgetown is an Ivy League school, because you've got to be brilliant to find the classrooms. Right? Am I right? And I like the comment you made about the sort of the plodding along, right? I've heard people say sometimes it takes 10 years to become an overnight success, right? So the things that these folks are doing right now, and I can tell you from our experiences last year, just plotting and plotting and plotting and very unglamorous. We did our first meetup, 2 people showed up, right, after a month of hardcore promotion. And then month after month, 2, 3, 4 people, and a lot of you guys have survived this last year, right, through the disillusionment stuff. This is where the courage and the fortitude, and if you are a visionary, if you are committed to change, right, it's hard. I mean, things don't change unless you have to If it was easy, it would change, right? But we need folks like you to be involved in that. And then you talked about how people are coming together in somewhat non-traditional spaces. The best place you can come together. Shameless promotion, GBA Global. Okay.
that was shameless.
Ryan, your thought.
So there's a lot of easily identified use cases where blockchain can actually impact what is going on in government. But I really think that what's going to happen is that blockchain is going to happen in the private sector and then find application in the public sector. The example that you brought up is the pharmaceutical supply chain and the fraudulent drug epidemic. I mean, because that's really what it is. It's a huge, huge problem. We're going to see the pharmaceuticals implement a supply chain, and then they're going to go to their wholesalers, which then do the distribution to both the patients as well as to the pharmacies. And they're going to be the ones that will do it. And then all of a sudden, we're going to see then the regulators are going to come in and say, I like this. Everyone has to do it. That's what's going to happen. Because really, we're not looking for the government to provide innovation. That's never going to happen from the government. Innovation has to happen outside, and then it has to be so overwhelmingly wonderful that the government has no other choice than to adopt it. So we can look at things like land registries. We can look at things like any part of the defense supply chain would make a lot of sense to be able to resource things back to the raw materials, going all the way from the raw materials to the production product that's being delivered. There's a lot of things that are there. Automotive, the aspect of having higher quality safety standards that would be institutionalized due to blockchain and having that transparency of that just doesn't exist at this point would be just phenomenal. But we can't look at government as the solution. I mean, this is the Government Blockchain Association, but the reason why we formed it, at least as Gerard has explained it to me, is because we want to raise the awareness of the technology to governments. And the only way the governments are actually going to respond, at least in my opinion, is the moment that they see that the innovation is so transformative that they have no other choice than to adopt it.
I agree. Absolutely. 100%, right? The private industry pushes technology forward, and then the government catches up or regulation is created, right? If Bitcoin didn't do what it did or people didn't adopt it, even at the level that they've adopted it, regulation wouldn't catch up. The SEC is heavily involved because it needs to be. The government, CNN talks about it because the people have accepted it. It's usually a mass majority that accept a technology or change, and then the government comes behind and catches up, right? For example, if Facebook didn't exist, would privacy laws on the internet exist? They wouldn't, right? So technology moves it forward, then the government catches up right behind it. And I think that's what will happen in the future as well. The private industries, right, will beat blockchain up, find real solutions that are profitable, that make sense, and then the government will catch up to it, like they always have been, right?
I agree.
And so the question I'm going to ask you is, from your experience in terms of where you've come now, right? What are some of the biggest takeaways, right, that you have, and what advice would you give people, companies, government today in terms of how to prepare for the future? So, what is your kind of big takeaway from your experience, and what advice would you give them, either individual, company, or government, to prepare for the future? Jim, let's start with you, and then we'll walk down this way.
This is a technology that can achieve tremendous efficiencies, billions in terms of cost savings. It's almost hard to quantify how much it could potentially save. It could potentially serve to restore some trust in government. It's transformational, but it's also scary, disruptive, threatening to the status quo. So there's going to be just enormous resistance. But all of you here, as I said, this is not a random sample off the street, but all of you here are basically apostles. You're interested enough to learn what this is about. And so the way it's going to catch on is not people reading about it, it's people talking about it, talking with your friends. When most of your friends, even your friends, which are, again, is not random, I'm sure, but your friends go, what is blockchain? I don't understand it, and you're going to have to figure out a way to give them an elevator explanation. You got to do it in 30 seconds before the door opens up. You're going to have to figure out how to do that. And to the extent that you do, they become empowered with the new technology. I mean, that's what it's going to be all about. In some ways, this is sort of a democratization movement, and as we know, knowledge is power. People who can share that knowledge and particularly can apply it are going to be in a uniquely advantaged position in terms of dealing with the future that we all have ahead of us. So I think it's very exciting, and I appreciate the fact that people like you, Gerard, have been sort of the, I don't know, Johnny Appleseed, planting seeds of understanding, a little inspiration. Just getting people together, that's what it takes. This is the most effective means of understanding and applying a new technology like this.
Well, I guess I'd say three things. First and foremost, make sure you go through the Georgetown certificates on blockchain. Main advice.
Just some shameless marketers.
That's the theme of the day. No, more seriously, maybe 2 points. One is, Joe, you started by introducing me as saying, you're doing some work on risk management. Blockchain is actually not something so much about risk management that it is about uncertainty management. So the difference between the two is that when you have risk management, you have a known unknown, right? With uncertainty management, you're dealing with unknown unknown, right? And so it could go in a host of different ways. And typically, when you think about risk management, you try to get more data, go for the best solution, and then you massively deploy it. With uncertainty management, it's different. It's more about getting options, trying few things, redundancy. It's inefficient, but you don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work, right? So a different framework, and perhaps a difficult one to operate under if you're a large organization, because if you're sophisticated enough, you understand risk management, but you typically have more trouble with uncertainty management, right? So that's the second thing. And then my previous point notwithstanding, where do I think the main applications will be? Certainly could be wrong, but I'm not sure that the main applications will be the flashy one that we have talked about a lot. I don't want to get into the great debate of lightning and sharding and God knows what, but I think the most fundamental applications will be in back office on things that are extremely boring, that we don't see, that we don't care until they don't work. And then suddenly we care a lot. Okay. So financial sector, transfer of funds, back office, record keeping, the making sure that the medicines are safe, things that we don't think about until we really think about them because we have a big problem.
So my view is this, is that blockchain technology is an infrastructure technology. It's so different than any disruptive technology we've seen before. So when the internet came out, it actually lubricated communication in ways that we'd never seen before. With our smartphones, we were able to actually access the world. We were able to now translate things almost instantaneous. Those are communication issues. Blockchain is that infrastructure. I agree totally. I think, though, that what is the biggest institutional barrier to anything that is going to happen with the adoption of blockchain is actually human capital. What we're dealing with is this, is that it's been estimated that there's roughly about 25,000 full-time developers globally doing blockchain. That's it, 25,000. It's estimated that for the financial sector, they need 250,000. So what are we talking about? 10 times the available number of people.
Georgetown certificates.
I'm going to do a self-promotion here for a moment here. So I own the Blockchain Academy, and if you want to have some really phenomenal blockchain training, you just come to me, because I'll have it done quickly. But that aside, so the other aspect of it is that when you start to look at the sectors, you go, financial sector, 250,000, the insurance sector, 250,000, healthcare, almost 300,000 is estimated. The supply chain, 2.5 million people, developers are needed for this. We have a core crew of just 25,000. The only way blockchain technology is going to be implemented is if we have the resources, the human capital that actually can do this implementation. You can't take a major financial institution and say, I'm going to give these 5 guys and they're going to be able to transform this whole thing. It's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, for that one institution to actually transform these legacy systems. You talked about legacy systems. It is estimated that every major financial sector has 40,000 legacy systems internally each. 40,000 legacy systems using COBOL. that hasn't even had any changes in the past 40 years as a language. All right, 60 years. It's horrific, and yet
He
we're
knows. He
highly
was there at the
dependent
beginning.
upon this. But getting back to it, the only way it's going to happen is not on the thought process of innovation. It's actually on the implementation side. And the only way we're going to do that is if we develop our human capital and get more developers out there and all the people who support the developing process to be a part of this. And that's the only time that we're going to finally have any true blockchain implementation on an enterprise level. That's it.
I know, guys, it gets a little overwhelming talking about these large numbers and this big change, but you can do it on a very micro level, right? Me and Gerard met a couple of years at a random bar at a meetup, right? Get involved in your local meetups.
It's too
Go
much
buy-
information, you know?
You know, go buy $10 worth of Bitcoin from Coinbase and see how the transaction really happens, right? Everybody can do that, right? You don't need millions of dollars. You don't need a master's degree. You don't need a certification. Go get involved in your local meetup, talk to people, discuss your ideas, go buy $10 worth of Bitcoin, see how the transaction is, see how much the fee is, see what the process is. You can get involved on a very small level where it becomes overwhelming when you listen to all these large numbers and governments getting involved, and it always starts at the root grass, right? You get involved, your friends get involved, then bigger communities are built, and then everybody gets involved. But you can do it on a very small level, like Congressman said, right? It all starts with you guys.
So, and incidentally, in terms of getting involved, I'm going to do some more shameless promotion, right? GBAglobal.org, right? A couple things. If you go to the resources tab under the main menu and go down to training, you'll see Bryant's company there. GBA's got training folks globally to do training. I know that Bryant does online training and in-person training globally, but there's some great resources there. There's also presentations you can download. There's articles. We have about 8 gigs worth of data. I think I mentioned that I've been told 2 things. I don't know how to validate it. One is that we're the largest blockchain association in the world. Again, I don't know if it's true, but it could be. And then the other one is we're becoming the go-to source for information. So I know Gustavo posts a lot of information. We have over 8 gigs worth of just information if you just want to learn, right? And so you don't even have to be a member for that. That's freely available to the public. But if you're a member, it's better, okay?
Paying member.
A paying member is even better than that, right? Anybody in government can join the GBA for free, so it's a great resource for, just like the Congressman said, we want to really help government. You know, people ask, why is government in our name? We have a lot of private industry, right? Because the private industry wants to help government understand this technology, and we want to work together to move together to a better future so that it's not chaotic, right? So we don't get hit by a train. I've got 2 questions that I think haven't already been addressed. Do we have anybody in the room that's a healthcare professional, healthcare expert? Anybody in the healthcare field?
I did a course on it recently.
You did?
Yeah, I created a whole course.
Sorry, are you so? All right, so I'm going to address the question to anybody who wants to address. And this is a healthcare question. And then the other one I think goes to you, Jim, because it's more congressional related. The healthcare question is, could blockchain or cryptocurrency be used to disrupt enormous healthcare and drug plans? Any thoughts on that?
Sure.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, please. I'm happy to defer.
Okay. I mean, the whole idea of what blockchain can do for healthcare, especially as it relates to health records. So the statistics are as follows, that the average person sees 18.7 doctors over the course of their life, different doctors. All of the records are actually all dispersed. And depending on who you go to, those records might have been stored in a database that is no longer even accessible. So nobody has a complete health record. What we see with blockchain as an opportunity is actually the way to consolidate these things into, you would be able to have your own patient health record. And the ability to have that would then have immense value as it relates to not only your own personal health, but the community's health. So like if there's an outbreak, the CDC wouldn't have to go in and try to find these things. They would actually have a single resource that they could go to find out more about the impact on society. But as it relates to drug usage and prescription drugs being used, there's really a poor quality of information that is available for these researchers to use simply because of HIPAA and GDPR now that are impacting who can actually see things, what transparencies are they, what is the total overall health of the participating people. So the CDC has come out and said that they would actually like to see a blockchain solution simply because it would help for them to actually deal with outbreaks. You're looking at food contamination, so again, that's a part of the same thing as it relates to it. So most of the blockchain dialogue that I put together a course about this, so you can go on and actually take the course. But the reality of it is
And
that
pay for it.
right, is that there's so many areas where blockchain can actually help both the individual, the local community, and then the national communities just to manage these things from every aspect, from usage, effectiveness, pharmaceutical aspects of it. There's just an unlimited number of ways the blockchain could actually assist in the healthcare arena.
Don't you think the problem is the existing system, right? So medical records or medical data is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? They don't want the consumer to have your own records.
No. That's the whole purpose of it.
Yeah.
The way that this current society is constructed is that, so if you go to a particular practice, and so like I'm a member of Valley Health, which is large in northern New Jersey, so all my records are there. If I went to a different practice, they wouldn't necessarily want to transfer over these things.
Yeah.
So they're holding these things on simply because they view it as a way to maintain their patients,
Absolutely.
their clients,
Yeah.
really, technically. But that has to change.
I agree.
And simply because think of all the redundancy. You go see a doctor, and everything that you do, you go then to the next doctor, everything has to be done again. What does that do to the cost of healthcare? Well, it shoots it straight through the roof. No one has the ability to say, you know what, this has already been done, let me look at it. That's it.
So I agree with a good chunk of what you said, right? And I think there are also applications in medical research,
There too.
credentialing, and there are all kind of good things, right?
Yep.
But coming back to the point I was making before, we're going to be massively distributing very private and sensitive information. And that's going to impact you. It's going to impact your family as well. Can anyone foresee what the state of computer science will be 30, 40 years down the road?
No.
So before I start passing my DNA information to a blockchain, to something that goes into the wild, I'm going to pause for a second, right? So invoicing, short-term information, relatively insensitive, I'm with you. But I think we have to be careful about what we put in this system and then spread into the...
Well, using the DNA example, I think that's already a moot point, simply because how many of you have actually done a DNA test? Okay. The law enforcement groups are actually trying to find out, resolutions to problems, crimes that were committed. And they're actually going to these public DNA databases to find who's the closest next of kin based on these DNA evidence that might be 20, 30 years old. And they're actually finding these criminals. So I think that has already been out. That's out of the bag. The cat's been loose. And think of Iceland. Iceland has 400,000 people, and their entire DNA database of every individual is now publicly available. So handing over DNA to a blockchain means almost nothing because everyone's already done it. I mean, you wouldn't want to, if you were a congressman, say, necessarily that I want to have everything about my physical health released to the world, because there might be things that you want to keep private. Maybe I have a heart murmur that I don't want to talk about.
I know that one of the GBA member companies is DNA Ticks, and they already are DNA data is already on the blockchain. There's several solutions like that already.
Right, it's there, it's gone.
It's crazy.
It's not necessarily a good thing, though.
Yeah, real quick, because I want to get to some questions. One other question is, and Jim, this is for you, and if you can keep it brief. A lot of the states are like Wyoming and different states are passing state laws, and the question is regarding blockchain and cryptocurrency. What do you think are the chances of the federal preemption of state laws by the new Congress in some of these?
I don't think the new Congress is going to touch this. They don't understand it. There's too much on their plate. I think they're probably going to legalize medicinal marijuana and things like that, and some of these industries that they don't have control over that are sort of fueling the black market. But I think what you are going to see much more of this at the state level, particularly in the smaller states where they can maintain control. Healthcare, you mentioned, is the most target-rich opportunity because it's a sixth of our economy. As the old folk keep living and can access virtually for free medical care system, it's going to be a fifth of our economy. And the first step in getting some control over the healthcare sector is transparency. You got to know where the money. Even Georgetown, if you were to go into the emergency room, and your insurance, for the most everybody's here, their insurance is going to cover it, I suspect. But look at the original bill, and then try to track where that money went and how it was concocted, and all of these people that supposedly interacted with you that you never saw and will never hear from. So, as I say, that healthcare is probably the first step and would pay the biggest rewards in terms of applying a new technology for transparency and for accountability.
And in that regard, the GBA is actually launching a blockchain healthcare certification course. If you go to our website, there's more information about it. I want to open this up to questions from the audience, right?
When we have new technology, inevitably we do have foreseen risks, and we also have uncertainty, but no one has really touched on the cybersecurity aspect of this. We talked about health information. We talked about applications for a number of different things, and to me, we cannot go and proceed without having some security around it. So if we could talk a little bit about cybersecurity specifically, I'd appreciate it.
It's your ballywick.
All right, I can try this one. No one knows for sure, but my sense is that there are two things. Things that are on the blockchain per se, okay, which seem to be pretty secure today, but we don't know what will happen tomorrow, okay. And then where we have a lot of vulnerabilities will be around the blockchain. Okay, so let's talk about cryptocurrency to give an example. You've got the amount that is on the blockchain itself, but then you need wallets that will be an interface between the chain and the rest of the world. Those wallets are very easy to break, right? Sometimes by the people who actually sell those wallets, right? Because they have a direct access to the technology. So the blockchain itself, at the moment, seems to be relatively robust, but anything around the blockchain is pretty weak at the moment.
But we're already in a digital world, right? As easily as somebody can hack your digital wallet, can hack your online bank account, right? So
Not quite.
why is that?
Totally
Wells
different.
Fargo was down for 24 hours, like a few months
The
ago.
security for large banks is more robust than some wallet in countries far from here with the guy that has no track record and has access to the source code. That's not the case for
So,
large
but
financial
let's
institutions.
talk about exchanges, right? Not wallets. Talk about Coinbase. Coinbase hasn't been hacked yet, right?
Do you know how much they spend on their security?
Yeah,
It's an incredible amount.
so
But how many exchanges have actually failed because they were hacked? Too many.
yeah,
Far too many.
absolutely.
I mean, what is it? I think that I read last year that in 2018 that $1 billion was actually stolen from exchanges.
Internationally, right? How much money was stolen from banks digitally in the past 10 years,
I have no idea.
right? It probably supersedes that.
From the bank itself, it's very
How
limited.
much money was lost with the 2008 financial crisis?
Right?
Well, no.
That's a difference. That's
There's no cybersecurity issue where
That isn't. That's not even a fair assessment.
It's key to why Satoshi invented this.
Yeah.
$14 trillion
Yeah.
was lost as a result of the financial crisis.
That wasn't a security issue, and
That's not
Satoshi
cyber,
didn't
right.
create blockchain. So let's get that straight.
Let me get us back to the question. Whoa. Let me get us back to the question, right? With regard to cybersecurity, right? I think, Gilles, you hit the nail on the head. I think in two ways. Number one, the blockchain itself is very secure. Now, I'm not going to say it's absolutely secure because I think that there's some people would say it's absolutely. I would say it's very, very, very secure, right? But the risk is around the margins. There's also a big paradigm shift, right? So, for example, we have a cybersecurity working group. If you're interested in cybersecurity, I would invite you to join. One of the things, AJ is not here, he leads that group. We wrote a paper on how to get an open public blockchain system through the FISMA ATO process, right? And I believe you were involved in that, Sandy. But it's a big paradigm shift because the old paradigm is let's put everything together, let's build a big wall around it, right, and not let anybody in. The problem is when they do get in, they get to all the OMB records, right? They get to everything, right? We have had those hacks, right? Now, if you have a blockchain solution and you have everything distributed, right, there are a lot of people that argue, right, that system is more secure. There's a lot of people that believe it's less secure. The reality is that the technology is very new. It hasn't been around very long. There's a lot of theoretical advances there, but it's still early, right? I like your slide when you're trying. We're still learning, right? Versus
We're still learning,
right? So, Mike Bombas, yeah.
I would just say that challenging initial assumptions in blockchain is really important. And I agree with like 99% of what you said. And a lot of people assume that blockchains are always secure, especially the larger blockchains like the initial Nakamoto blockchain or cryptocurrency, I guess, and proof of work. But if it becomes a large enough platform, and a lot of people, especially if you're in a startup land, view things from a platform standpoint, Stripe, Facebook, etc. If it gets to a higher level and more people are using it, then there's a larger threat, whether it's national security or other.
Yeah, come up here for that. I want you to say a couple things in the microphone so that other folks can hear. You just come up for a second. All right. Yeah, no, yeah. So I want to just tell you a little bit about Mike Bob, because for those of you that are going to network around it, we're going to go to lunch. I want you to know who Mike is. So Mike has two roles. He's our legal counsel, but he also runs a financial regulatory. Is that right? The financial regulatory. We have about 50 working groups. Tell them just a little bit about your background, right? So that afterwards, if they have questions when we go to lunch, they know who to talk to.
I just wanted to sit in the back and opine. Fortunately. So I'll be really brief. I guess I've been in the space since 2011, 2012. I'm doing research in law school and then different roles, government, industry, et cetera, Citigroup, Ripple for a little bit, Bitcoin debit card, and then Booz Allen for a little bit, and different government clients in different capacities, I guess. But more than anything, it's just GBA now, and making sure that we can be that value add for public and private. And it's exciting to see this because I'd say my early volunteer efforts were with DATA, Digital Asset Transfer Authority, which doesn't really exist anymore, and it predated everybody else, Coin Center, Chamber of Digital Commerce, all those. And when I saw what Gerard had done really early on with GBA, it was quite exciting. So to see this is fantastic. So.
And you did You did compliance for Ripple, right?
Under the settlement agreement, it helped address that.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, if there was a question about SEC, right? This is the guy to talk to because he understands the regulatory environment. Yeah, you're not going to eat any lunch today. You're just going to. All right. Sounds good. Yes, sir.
Do we need more publicized failure? Implementation's been one of the biggest issues in any network that we need.
Gosh, I hope we don't have more failure than we've already had. So the question is, do we need more publicized failure? I'm going to respond briefly and then open it up to you guys. Look, I think failure is good, right? 2017, I think, was good because it shook out a lot of the junk, right? And the ones that are the real players, right? Hopefully they're still standing. I think publicized failure is good, right? And I also encourage people to fail quickly, right, and to fail often, right? Because the technology is moving so quickly. Try stuff, right? Learn from it, and then try something else. You guys want to comment on that before? I want to try to get in as many questions as possible. Yes, sir.
Going back to the basis for the event, the future of money. So, if you look, the conventional economic textbooks say the functions of money, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. These are mainly written by white economists who always leave out the critical fourth function of money which Satoshi surfaced, which is as a means of social control. So if you can talk about kind of what the future is, which again was the title of this event, with respect to those, you can deal with the three. It's hard for you guys to talk about that fourth function. But if you want to talk about that fourth function, that's fine. With respect to crypto and blockchain and all the stuff that we're talking about.
Well, let's focus on the fourth one because everyone, the three is a store of value, medium of exchange, right? Let's talk about the fourth one because I think that really is. So, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think the true change, guys, comes from there's 6 billion people on Earth, right? 6 and change. 2 billion people in the world right now are unbanked, right? No bank wants to deal with them. They don't make enough money. They don't have the right papers. But where digital currency or Bitcoin or whatever digital currency you're talking about hits home really hard is to those 2 billion people. All they need is a cell phone with an internet connection and they can have an account. They can move money to their friends, family, save it, do anything they want with it. Because traditional banks don't want to deal with that 2 billion people because they're too poor for them to pay any interest to, right? May they be in India or Africa or Pakistan or Thailand. I mean, here in the United States, most people have bank accounts because we live in a first world country. But in those countries, that's where the impact hits home hard.
So,
Yeah.
I'll just add to this a little bit here. So, the south of the planet, South America, Africa, South Asia, there's a vast discrepancy, generally speaking, in terms of wealth. They need to gain control over their wealth, their governance, their future. And what they're invariably doing now is PayPal, some form of that. They're keeping their bank right there on their cell phone. So it's a fairly easy transition to have a virtual wallet on their cell phone where I think they're probably going to leapfrog over a whole lot of our financial institution, traditional infrastructure, and go right to some form of Bitcoin. And it does give them some real independence from their government, and I think it empowers them to get to your point.
You may want to consider.
Could I just respond to that? I agree with what you're saying, Bill. And just to rebut kind of what you're saying, Nabeel, is that I think there is a problem of unbanked here in America who are at the poverty line below it and cannot access either credit or banks or credit cards or cannot afford a cell phone or access to internet. So our discussion here has been based on the assumption that people have access to those things and can use cryptocurrency or whatever. But some states are actually looking at implementing laws that require different stores and other organizations to accept cash to not leave that population behind. So as we move forward, if people are accepting cryptocurrency, we're all moving towards digital payments as the majority of it, that gap grows. What are your thoughts on addressing that gap to ensure that population is not left behind?
So, it's a quick one.
As the future.
You know what? Why don't we just go to the answer? Because I don't know that I can recap the question.
I think fiat will always coexist, right? It always will be there because there'll be a certain amount of people that will always use cash. Like my father, he doesn't even have a debit card. I've told him so many times, but he loves cash. He's always used cash for the past 40 years, and he always has cash on him. I think it will always coexist. I think digital currency isn't here to replace it. It's just to work alongside with it, to give you another choice or another option.
I agree with that, but let me just make a comment. So our country initially empowered only white men who own 25 acres or more, property owners. And we still haven't broken from that model because you can't borrow money unless you've got an asset. Most primarily your home. That's where you collateralize. That's how you send your kids to college and so on. And that's how wealth is created. Wealth isn't created from earned income. It's created from the appreciation of your assets. And so this country now, when you have it's almost half of the wealth is really controlled, not even by 1%, it's about a tenth of a percent. 40 families own as much as the bottom 50%. I don't want to sound too much like Bernie, so I'll get off the statistics. But that system is built, its foundation is that original concept. It's an aristocracy still. Our wealth is determined by the value we own. I do think that an alternative, and that's why I made the comment about looking around the room. You know, this is America. This is in the small terms, democratic group of people who are very representative. That's encouraging, and it's enormous. In fact, it's shocking to me in a positive way. So I do think there is potential here to move us forward in the direction that you imply we should be going, and I agree with that.
Sir.
Thank you very much for bringing up wealth. I do appreciate that. What are your indications of interest, or what is your opinion as it relates to the IRS treatment, the IRS tax treatment on cryptocurrency? I think there was just a new ruling in January.
Right. I'm going to address that quickly, and then I got to get us to wrap up unless you guys have any burning comments. Well, the IRS currently considers cryptocurrency to be a property, which means you have to pay capital gains on it, right? The challenge with that is any vendor, any company that wants to use cryptocurrencies in their business processes now has an incredible business overhead, because that means every time, if I'm Starbucks, every time money comes in or goes out, I have to know the price of that, and I have to essentially record capital gains and losses. There are apps and tools that essentially are addressing that. They're not really there yet. So that is when I think of the barriers to adoption, the IRS treatment of cryptocurrency is a barrier to adoption. The other one is ease of use. Apps and new technologies are addressing that. And the other one is speculation or volatility, right? The volatility will get handled as the population grows. The currency will become more stable, right? The IRS treatment of cryptocurrencies is a by fiat barrier. There may be political pressure to change that at some point, right? But unless that political pressure is exerted, it will continue to be a barrier to cryptocurrency adoption. Any other thoughts on that?
I nailed it.
Okay, good. Listen, gosh, I wish I could respond to all your questions. It's after 12 o'clock. And real quick question, did you guys get some value out of this? Is it something we ought to do again?